Hello, friends. Welcome to Future Tech Minds. If you are new to programming or just starting with a Python, this video is the perfect place to begin. Python is one of the easiest and most powerful programming languages, making it a favorite for beginners and experts alike. In this video, we'll break down the basics of Python in a simple, beginner friendly way. By the end, you'll have a clear understanding of what Python is and why it's such a valuable skill to learn. In today's video, we'll be covering some key Python concepts that every beginner should know. First, we'll start with an introduction to Python where we'll explore what Python is and why it's so popular. Next, we'll dive into data types and variables, understanding the different types of data Python can handle and how to store them using variables. Then, we'll learn about conditional statements which help us control the flow of our code based on a certain conditions. We'll also cover loops which allow us to repeat a specific task and make our code more efficient. Lastly, we'll explore functions which help us organize our code and reuse it efficiently. Let's get started with these topics and build a strong foundation in Python programming. First, we will quickly go over the introduction of Python. Python is a versatile and beginner friendly programming language that's easy to learn but incredibly powerful. It was created back in 1991 by Guido van Rossum and has since become a favorite for developers worldwide. Python is a powerhouse used in web development, data science, artificial intelligence, and so much more. Its simple syntax, massive library support, and ease of use make it perfect for beginners and pros alike. So, why should we learn Python? Let's explore some great reasons. First, Python is in high demand in job markets with roles like developers seeking Python skills. It's also cross platform, meaning it runs seamlessly on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, no matter what system you're using. Python is perfect for automation, scripting, and prototyping, making it essential tool for quick and efficient development. Plus, it's open source and has a massive community, meaning tons of resources and support are just a click away. For example, you can use Python to automate tasks like renaming multiple files in a folder with a just few lines of code. Now, let's go through variables and data types in Python. In programming language, variables are used to store data that we can reuse later in our programs. For example, if we write x is equals to 10, the variable x stores the value of 10. Python is dynamically typed, which means you don't need to declare the type of data for a variable. You just assign a value and Python figures out the rest. However, there are some rules for naming a variable, like no spaces and avoid keywords that are already used in Python. For example, you can have a variable like name is equals to Alice where the string Alice is stored in the variable name. So, variables are essential for managing data in your programs, and knowing them how to use properly will make your code more efficient. Now, let's dive into Python's data types, which are essential building blocks of programming. First, let's start with the simple data types. These are straightforward and commonly used in Python. We have numbers, which include integers like 1042, floats, which are decimal numbers like 3.142.71. Next, we have strings, which are sequences of characters like hello with double quotes. They are great for working with text. And finally, there are booleans, which represent two values, true or false. Now, let's talk about complex data types, which are more structured and versatile. First, we have lists, which are ordered collection of items. For example, 123 in a square bracket is a list. Then there are dictionaries, which store data in key value pairs. For example, key colon value is an example for dictionaries. Then tuples, which are similar to lists but immutable. For example, 123 in brackets is a tuple that can't be changed after it's created. Lastly, there are sets, which are an ordered collection of unique items. For example, 1, 2, 3 in curly brackets ensure there are no duplicates. These data types make Python incredibly flexible for handling all sorts of data and tasks. Now let's explore some common operations you can perform on different data types in Python. For arithmetic operations, you can easily add, subtract, multiply, or divide numbers. For example, 5 plus 3 gives you 8 and 10 divided by 2 gives you 5. With working with strings, you can concatenate them using the plus operator. So, hello string plus world will result in hello world. For list, you can add a new item using append method and remove them with pop, or slice the list to access specific elements. For example, my list is equals to 1, 2, 3, and my list append 4 adds 4 to the list. With dictionaries, you can get values by using the key. For example, if you have my dictionary is equals to name colon Alice, you can access Alice by writing my dictionary name. Now, let's go through a simple example where we can calculate the area of a circle. We start by defining the radius of a circle. For this example, let's say the radius is 5. Now, we calculate the area using the formula. In Python, we can represent this as area is equals to 3.14 into radius square. Finally, we print the result using print function with an f string for formatting. When we run the code, we get the output area is equals to 78.5. And that's how you can calculate the area of a circle in Python. Now, let's go through another example of working with list and strings in Python. First, let's go with the list. Here, we have a list of fruits. So now, we'll add a new fruit using the append method. We'll add mango to the list. Next, we'll access an item from the list by its index. Let's print the first item of the list, which is an index 0. When we run the code, we get an output called apple. Now, let's move to the string. Here, a string says Python is fun. We can use the upper method to convert the entire string to the uppercase. When we run this code, we get Python is fun in all uppercase. Now let's talk about conditional statements in Python and why they are so important. Conditional statements direct the flow of your program by executing code based on a certain conditions. The key structure for conditional statements are if, else, and elif. You can also use loops alongside this to make decision dynamically. For example, if a condition is true, then if block will run. If it's false, the else block will run. And elif lets you check additional conditions. This simple and readable syntax makes Python easy to understand and even for the beginners. Conditional statements are used to make decisions in your code, allowing your program to respond to different situations and inputs. So, whether you're checking if a number is even or deciding what to do based on users' input, conditional statements make it possible. Now, let's dive into if-else statements and how they help you to make decisions in Python. To compare values, we use comparison operators like lesser than, greater than, equals, and exclamatory equals. These operators let you check things like if one value is greater than another or if two values are equal. You can also use logical operators like and, or, and not to combine multiple conditions. For example, if you want to check if a number is greater than 5 and less than 10, you can use AND. For multiple conditions, we can use elif to check additional cases. This is useful when you have more than two possible outcomes. Let's look at an example. In this following example, if x is greater than 10, the program will print greater. If it's smaller or equal, it will print smaller or equal. So, if else statements are essential for controlling the flow of your program and make decisions based on a different condition. Now, let's talk about loops in Python and how they can help you to automate tasks. Loops are used to execute a block of code repeatedly, which makes them perfect for automating repetitive tasks. Python supports two main types of loops, the for loop and the while loop. The for loop is used to iterate over sequences like lists, tuples, or ranges. This is useful when you want to repeat an action for each item in a sequence. The while loop, on the other hand, repeats a block of code until a certain condition becomes false. So, whether you need to process each item in a list or repeat actions based on a condition, loops makes your Python code more efficient and flexible. Now, let's learn about for loop in Python and see how it works. A for loop is used to iterate over sequence like lists, tuples, and even strings. It repeats a block of code a defined number of times based on its item in the sequence. The loop automatically stops when the sequence ends, so you don't have to worry about when it should stop. For example, the range function is often used with for loops to generate a sequence of numbers. So here is an example. As you can see in the following example, the for loop will print numbers from 0 to 4 because the range is 5. It generates numbers starting from 0 up to 4. So, for loops are a great way to repeat code for each time in a sequence or for a set of iterations. Now, let's talk about the while loop in Python. A while loop repeats a block of code as long as a specific condition is true. It's important to have a condition that eventually becomes false to avoid creating an infinite loop. The while loop is especially useful when the number of iterations isn't predefined and you want the loop to continue running based on the condition. Often, you'll pair a while loop with an increment or decrement operation to update the condition, ensuring the loop eventually stops. Here's an example. As you can see in the following example, in this code, the while loop starts with x is equals to 0. It will print x and then increment x by 1 each time. The loop will stop when x reaches 5. So, a while loop is perfect for situations where you don't know exactly how many times you need to repeat an action, but you know when to stop. Now, let's take a look at two important statements in Python, break and continue. The break statement is used to exit the loop immediately, no matter where you are in the loop. On the other hand, the continue statement skips the current iteration of the loop and moves on to the next one. Both of the statements give you more control over how your loops execute. They often used in conditional scenarios where you want to either stop the loop or skip certain steps based on a specific conditions. Here's a code example to show how they work. In the following example, the loop will break when I equals 5. If I is even, it will skip the rest of the loop and continue to the next iteration. So, the output will be 1, 3, because it skips even numbers and stops when I equals 5. And that's how you can control the loop execution using break and continue. Now, let's explore nested loops in Python, a powerful concept for handling complex tasks. A nested loop is simply a loop inside another loop. The inner loop executes completely for each iteration of the outer loop. Nested loops are commonly used when working with multi-dimensional data like matrices or when performing with more complex tasks that require multiple levels of iterations. However, be cautious with the performance because nested loops can slow down your program when working with large amount of data. Now, let's see an example of printing a matrix-like structure using nested loops. As you can see in the following example, the outer loop runs 3 times once for each row, and the inner loop runs 2 times for each column in the row. And the output will be row 0, column 0, row 0, column 1, row 1, column 0, row 1, column 1, row 2, column 0, row 2, column 1. So, nested loops are perfect when dealing with multi-dimensional data or more complex structures. Now, let's solve the example where we need to print the first five multiples of 3 using loops. We can approach this problem using either a for loop or a while loop. Let's start with the for loop approach. In a for loop, we can use range 1 to 6 to iterate through numbers from 1 to 5 and then multiply each number by 3. This will print the first 5 multiples of 3 and the output will be 3, 6, 9, 12 and 15. Now, let's see how to do the same using a while loop. As you can see in the while loop approach, we'll start with x is equals to 1 and keep printing 3 into x until x is 5. This will also give us the same output as 3, 6, 9, 12 and 15. Both approaches work, but the choice of loops depends on your specific needs and the scenario. Now, let's talk about functions in Python and why they are so useful. Functions help us organize and reuse code. Instead of writing the same code multiple times, we can define a function once and call it whenever we need it. They also help reduce redundancy, making our programs cleaner and more efficient. Another big advantage of function is that they improve readability. By giving our function meaningful names, we make the code easier to understand. Functions can also take arguments, which are values we pass to them, and they return values, which are result from the function's execution. Now, let's look at an example. As you can see here, we define a function called square, which takes one argument number and returns its square. So, if we call square 4, it will return 6. Function make your code more modular, efficient, and easier to manage, especially as your program grows larger. Now, let's go through how to define and call a function in Python. To define a function, we can use def keyword followed by the function name and parameters. Then, we write the code that should be executed inside the function. To call the function, you simply use its name and pass any required arguments. You can also define default arguments. This means if no value is passed, the function will use the default value. For example, in the greet function, we can set the default name to user. You can also use keyword argument when calling a function, like greet name is equals to Alice, where you explicitly mention the argument name. So here's an example of defining and calling a function to greet someone. In this example, we define the greet function, which takes one parameter, name, and returns a greeting message to call it. You would write greet Alice and it will return hello Alice. Functions are a powerful way to organize and reuse your code efficiently. Now, let's talk about Lambda functions in Python, which are short, anonymous, and single line functions. Lambda functions allow us to define a simple function in just one line without needing to use the def keyword. The syntax is simple: lambda arguments colon expression. Lambda functions are often used for small tasks like sorting, mapping, or filtering data. Here's a small example. In this example, we define a lambda function that squares a number. When we call square 4, it lambda functions are great when you need to a quick function for a small task, and they help to keep your code clean and concise. Now, let's see a simple code example to demonstrate how function works in Python. We define a function called add which takes two parameters a and b and returns their sum. In the following example, we can see the add function which 5 and 3 as arguments and it returns the sum which is 8. This is how you can define a simple function, call it with arguments and print the result. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe to Future Tech Minds. We'll soon be back with part 2 where we'll dive into more Python concepts.